George Strait invites an elderly man on stage to sing his favorite song. What this man does moves everyone. The humid Texas evening wrapped around the AT&T Stadium like a familiar embrace, carrying with it the anticipation of 60,000 country music fans who had traveled from every corner of America to witness what many considered the final farewell tour of the greatest country artist who ever lived. George Harvey Strait, at 73 years old, stood behind the stage curtains, adjusting his signature black cowboy hat and running his weathered fingers along the smooth neck of his Martin guitar. The weight of 4 decades in the spotlight pressed gently on his shoulders, but his eyes still sparkled with the same passion that had driven a young ranch hand from Petite, Texas, to become the undisputed king of country music. Outside, the crowd's energy was palpable. Generations of families sat together, grandparents who had danced to Amarillo Morning in honky-tonk bars during the 80s, parents who had fallen in love to I Cross My Heart in the 90s, and young adults discovering the timeless magic of authentic country storytelling. The stadium's massive screens displayed a montage of George's career highlights, 61 number-one hits, more than any artist in any genre, album sales exceeding 100 million worldwide, and a legacy that had shaped the very definition of country music for nearly half a century. In the sea of cowboy hats and boots, tucked away in a modest seat in section 112, sat William Bill Thompson, an 89-year-old man whose gnarled hands clutched a handwritten sign that read, 89 years old, Vietnam veteran, last wish, to sing with my hero. The cardboard was already dampening from his trembling palms, but Bill held it with the same determination that had carried him through the rice paddies of Da Nang 56 years earlier. 3 weeks prior, Dr. Martinez at the Houston VA Medical Center had delivered news that no man his age wanted to hear. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, perhaps 2 months if he was fortunate, maybe less if he wasn't T. Bill's granddaughter Sarah had insisted on driving him the 4 hours from their small town of Beaumont to Arlington, despite her concerns about his deteriorating health. She sat beside him now, occasionally glancing at her grandfather with a mixture of love and worry that only family members understand. Sarah had watched Bill transform over the past month since the diagnosis, from a man resigned to his fate to someone suddenly desperate to accomplish something he had kept buried for decades. If anyone had bothered to ask about the small, unassuming man with the weathered Marine Corps cap and the faded denim shirt, they might have discovered that Bill Thompson had once possessed a voice that could make angels weep. Before Vietnam, before the nightmares that followed him home, before the decades of silence that trauma can impose on even the most gifted souls, Bill had been the rising star of East Texas country music. Local radio stations had played his demos, Nashville scouts had shown interest, and record producers had made promises that seemed as golden as the sunset over the Sabine River. The opening act finished their set, and the lights dimmed as the familiar opening notes of "Here for a Good Time" filled the stadium. George Strait emerged from the shadows like a figure from country music mythology, his presence commanding instant reverence from every person in attendance. His voice, still rich and smooth as aged whiskey, filled every corner of the massive venue as he launched into a set that would span his entire illustrious career. For 90 minutes, George transported his audience through the soundtrack of their lives. Cowboys and ranchers sang along to Cowboy Rides Away, young couples swayed to Love Without End, Amen, and 3 generations of families united their voices during All My Exes Live in Texas. Bill Thompson knew every word to every song, his voice harmonizing quietly with his idol's, tears streaming down his cheeks as memories of dancing with his late wife Margaret to these very melodies came flooding back. As the night progressed, Bill's grip on his sign tightened. The pain in his abdomen, a constant reminder of his mortality, seemed to fade whenever George's voice filled the air. This music had been his companion through the darkest moments of his life, from the foxholes of Southeast Asia to the lonely nights after Margaret G. Sess passing 5 years earlier. Tonight wasn't just about hearing his favorite songs performed live. It was about honoring a dream that had been deferred for far too long. Sarah noticed her grandfather's increasing restlessness during the brief intermission. "Grandpa, are you feeling okay? We can leave if you need to," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I am fine, sweetheart," Bill replied, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent for weeks. "I just need to find a way to get closer. I need him to see this sign." "Grandpa, there are 60,000 people here. He's not going to notice one person in the crowd." But Bill had already made up his mind. During his time in the service, he had learned that sometimes the most important battles required the greatest risks. As George returned to the stage for the second half of his performance, Bill began the slow, painful process of making his way toward the front of the stadium. Each step was a victory against age and illness, each breath a declaration that he wasn't ready to surrender without fighting for his dream. The crowd barely noticed the elderly man navigating through the rows of seats, but those who did couldn't help but admire his determination. A young couple offered to help him down the steep stairs, and a group of college students moved aside to let him pass, sensing something important was happening, even if they couldn't quite understand what it was. By the time George was midway through oceanfront property, Bill had managed to reach the general admission area near the stage. The security guards, trained to watch for potential disruptions, noticed the elderly man with the sign, but decided he posed no threat. His obvious frailty and the respectful way he held his handwritten message suggested he was simply another devoted fan, hoping for a moment of connection with his musical hero. George E.'s voice soared through "The Chair," one of his most beloved ballads, and Bill felt his heart racing as he recognized the song that had played during his first dance with Margaret at their wedding reception in 1958. The irony was, he lost on him that the song had been released nearly 30 years after their wedding, yet it had somehow captured the essence of their love story with uncanny precision. As the song reached its emotional peak, something extraordinary happened. George Strait, the consummate professional who had performed thousands of concerts without missing a beat, found his gaze drawn to the small figure holding the cardboard sign in the front row. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the distance between stage and audience, between legend and dreamer, between the man who had achieved everything and the man who still had one wish left to fulfill. The connection lasted only seconds, but George felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years of performing. Without breaking his rhythm, he finished "The Chair," while keeping one eye on the elderly veteran whose sign had somehow cut through the noise and chaos of 60,000 voices to reach his heart. As the final notes faded and the crowd erupted in applause, George made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him America's sweetheart for 4 decades, "before we continue tonight, I want to acknowledge someone special in our audience." The massive screens focused on George A.'s face, and 60,000 people fell silent, sensing that something unscripted was about to unfold. "There is a gentleman down front with the sign, and I think we all need to hear what he has to say." The stadium erupted in murmurs as heads turned and necks craned, trying to locate the person who had captured George Strait's attention. Bill Thompson felt his knees buckle as the realization hit him like a lightning bolt. After decades of dreaming, after weeks of dying, after a lifetime of wondering what if, the moment he had never dared to truly believe would happen was actually occurring. Security guards looked at each other uncertainly. This wasn't part of the show's carefully choreographed plan. George's tour manager, Mike Rodriguez, frantically gestured from the wings, trying to catch the singer's attention and redirect him back to the set list. But George Strait had built his reputation on authenticity, on connecting with real people who lived real lives. And something about the elderly man's presence felt more important than any predetermined schedule. "Sir, can you make your way to the stage?" George called out, his voice amplified by the stadium's sound system. "I'd like to meet you." The crowd's energy shifted from confusion to anticipation as they watched Bill Thompson begin the arduous journey from the general admission area toward the stage. Each step was a monumental effort for the cancer-ravaged body, but his spirit soared with every inch of progress. Other fans instinctively created a path for him, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Sarah had been watching from their original seats when she realized her grandfather was no longer beside her. Panic set in as she scanned the crowd, finally spotting him near the stage, just as George's invitation echoed through the stadium. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her dying grandfather attempt something that seemed impossible for a man in his condition. Two security guards, initially hesitant about this deviation from protocol, were moved by Bill's obvious determination and came forward to assist him. They flanked the elderly veteran, offering steady arms as he navigated the final steps toward the stage. The crowd, sensing the magnitude of the moment, began to applaud, not for the music, but for the courage of an old man chasing a dream that most people would have abandoned decades ago. As Bill reached the side of the stage, a stagehand extended a helping hand to guide him up the steps. Each movement was deliberate and careful, the pain in his abdomen now completely forgotten in the rush of adrenaline and anticipation. When he finally stood on the same platform as his musical hero, the reality of the moment threatened to overwhelm him completely. George Strait approached Bill with the same genuine warmth that had endeared him to millions of fans throughout his career. Up close, he could see the evidence of a life well lived, etched in the lines around Bill's eyes, the proud bearing that spoke of military service, and the unmistakable look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. "What's your name, son?" George asked, adjusting his microphone so the entire stadium could hear their conversation. "William Thompson, sir, but everyone calls me Bill," the veteran replied, his voice surprisingly strong despite his physical frailty. "I served with the 1st Marine Division in Vietnam, and I want you to know that your music got me through some of the darkest times of my life." A respectful hush fell over the crowd as they absorbed the weight of Bill's words. George nodded with genuine reverence, understanding that he was in the presence of someone who had sacrificed more for his country than most people could imagine. "Thank you for your service, Bill," George said, and the stadium erupted in applause that lasted nearly a full minute. When the noise finally died down, George continued, "I see you've got a sign there. What does it say?" Bill held up his cardboard message with trembling hands, his voice catching slightly as he read aloud, 89 years old, Vietnam veteran, last wish, to sing with my hero." The crowd's reaction was immediate and emotional. Thousands of people rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing something far more significant than a typical concert moment. George Strait, visibly moved by the simple honesty of the request, took a moment to compose himself before responding. "Well, Bill, I think we can make that happen," George said with a smile that lit up his entire face. "What song would you like to sing?" Bill's answer came without hesitation, as if he had been preparing for this question his entire life. "The Chair, sir? It was playing when I danced with my wife Margaret for the first time, and it was the last song I sang to her before she passed 5 years ago." The raw emotion in Bill's voice created a connection between performer and audience that transcended typical entertainment. This wasn't tea about show business or celebrity. This was about human connection, about love and loss, about dreams deferred but never forgotten. George felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came with truly meaningful moments, the kind that reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. "Margaret sounds like she was a special lady," George said softly, his words carrying the weight of genuine compassion. "She was the music in my life, sir," Bill replied, his voice steady despite the tears beginning to form in his eyes. "After Vietnam, I couldn't sing anymore. The music was just gone. But Margaret never stopped believing it would come back someday." The stadium was so quiet that even people in the furthest reaches could hear every word of their conversation. 60,000 strangers had become witnesses to an intimate moment of human vulnerability, and the collective emotional response was palpable. George A.S. band members, seasoned professionals who had seen everything during their decades of touring, found themselves deeply affected by the unfolding drama. "Tell you what, Bill," George said, making another spontaneous decision that would alter the course of both their lives, "let us see if Margaret was right about that music coming back." The ace in the whole band, following George's subtle cues, began the gentle opening chords of The Chair. The familiar melody drifted across the stadium like a prayer, and Bill Thompson closed his eyes, feeling something awakening deep within his soul that had been dormant for more than 50 years. The music that had been silenced by war, buried by trauma, and locked away by decades of pain, began to stir like a sleeping giant, finally ready to wake up. George handed Bill the microphone with an encouraging nod, stepping back slightly to give the veteran space while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. The stadium held its collective breath as Bill lifted the microphone to his lips, his weathered hands surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of the moment. For several seconds, only the gentle guitar melody filled the air, and some in the audience began to worry that perhaps this brave old man had bitten off more than he could chew. Then Bill Thompson opened his mouth, and something miraculous happened. The voice that emerged was nothing like what anyone expected from an 89-year-old man battling terminal cancer. Rich, deep, and perfectly pitched, it carried the smooth Texas drawl that had made George Strait famous, but with an added layer of gravitas that could only come from decades of living, loving, and surviving. The first words of The Chair floated across the stadium with such unexpected beauty that several people in the front rows gasped audibly. "Well, excuse me, but I think you've forgot my chair," Bill sang, his voice growing stronger with each word. "No, that one's not taken. I don't mind if you sit here." George Strait, a man who had shared stages with the greatest voices in country music history, felt his knees nearly buckle. This wasn't just good singing. This was extraordinary. The tone, the phrasing, the emotional delivery, everything about Bill's voice spoke of natural talent that had been refined by life experience into something truly special. George found himself taking an unconscious step backward, not from retreat, but from sheer amazement. The band members exchanged glances of disbelief. Steel guitarist Tommy White, who had played behind everyone from Willie Nelson to Merle Haggard, shook his head in wonder. Drummer Bobby Flores nearly missed his entrance, so captivated was he by the pure sound coming from the elderly veteran. Even the seasoned sound engineers in the booth scrambled to adjust their levels, realizing they were dealing with a voice of professional caliber. As Bill moved into the second verse, his confidence grew visibly. The years seemed to fall away from his face, and glimpses of the young man who had once dreamed of Nashville stardom flickered in his eyes. His posture straightened, his grip on the microphone became more assured, and his voice gained power with each passing line. "I'd like to talk to you, but you might think I'm strange," he continued, the emotion in his delivery making the familiar lyrics sound fresh and profound. "I've been watching you from way across the room, and I don't want to be forward or cause you any shame." Sarah had finally made her way to the front of the stadium, and when she heard her grandfather's voice over the sound system, she nearly collapsed. In all her 28 years, she had never heard him sing anything more than Happy Birthday in a quiet, self-conscious manner. The man on stage was a revelation, a completely different person than the quiet, reserved grandfather she thought she knew. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. "That cannot be, Grandpa." but it was Bill Thompson, transformed by music into the performer he had always been meant to be. The crowd was no longer simply listening, they were witnessing a resurrection. Phones appeared throughout the stadium as people began recording what they instinctively knew was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Social media posts began appearing within minutes. "You won to believe what's happening at the George Strait concert," and "This 89-year-old veteran is incredible." George, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. In 4 decades of performing, he had shared stages with legends, sung duets with icons, and been part of countless memorable moments. But this was different. This felt like destiny. When Bill reached the chorus, George couldn't help himself. He stepped forward and joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to have been crafted by angels. "But there's something about that chair," they sang together, their voices blending with an impossible perfection that sent chills through the massive audience. "There's something about that chair." The synergy between the two men was immediate and profound. George's smooth, familiar tone provided the perfect counterpoint to Bill's rich, lived-in voice. Together, they created something that was greater than the sum of its parts. A musical moment that transcended performance and became pure artistry. Tommy White, the steel guitarist, later described the moment as like watching lightning in a bottle. The band found themselves playing with an intensity and emotion they rarely achieved, inspired by the raw authenticity of what was unfolding before them. This wasn't a rehearsed duet or a carefully planned collaboration. This was organic magic happening in real time. As the song progressed, more details of Bill's remarkable story began to surface in George's mind. The phrasing, the natural vibrato, the instinctive understanding of country music as emotional language. None of this happened overnight. This man had been a singer, a real singer, at some point in his past. George found himself wondering what circumstances had conspired to keep such a talent hidden for so long. The third verse approached, and Bill's voice had found its full power now. The cancer, the age, the decades of silence, all of it seemed irrelevant in the face of this musical awakening. His voice soared through the intimate lyrics with a maturity and depth that made even George's masterful interpretation seem somehow less complete. "I sure like your smile and I like the way you laugh," Bill sang, his eyes closed, clearly thinking of his beloved Margaret. "I'd sure like to see you again. Would you give me that chance?" The crowd was completely under his spell now. 60,000 people swayed as one, many with tears streaming down their faces, all of them recognizing that they were part of something extraordinary. The usual concert atmosphere of casual entertainment had been transformed into something approaching religious experience. George stepped closer to Bill as they approached the final chorus, placing a gentle hand on the veteran's shoulder. The gesture was both supportive and reverent, acknowledgement from one master to another. When they sang the last "There's Something About That Chair" together, their voices created harmonies that seemed to hang in the Texas air long after the notes had faded. The final guitar chord rang out across the stadium, and for a moment, absolute silence reigned. Then, like a dam bursting, the applause began. It started in the front rows and rolled backward through the stadium like thunder, building to a crescendo that shook the very foundations of the building. People leaped to their feet, screaming, crying, and applauding with a fervor that had nothing to do with celebrity worship and everything to do with having witnessed something genuinely miraculous. Bill Thompson, the quiet old man who had arrived at the stadium with nothing but a cardboard sign and a dying wish, stood at the center of it all, microphone still in hand, looking dazed by what had just occurred. George Strait, one of the most celebrated performers in American music history, found himself applauding along with his audience, his face showing a mixture of admiration, surprise, and profound respect. But the evening was far from over. and neither Bill nor George realized that this moment of musical magic was about to reveal secrets that would change both of their lives forever. As the applause continued to wash over them, George leaned in close to Bill, his curiosity finally overcoming his amazement. "Bill," he said, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise, "where did you learn to sing like that?" The question hung in the air between them as the applause gradually subsided. Bill's eyes, still glistening with tears from the emotional performance, met George's with a mixture of pride and pain. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with how much of his story to reveal, decades of buried memories fighting their way to the surface. "George," Bill began, his voice hoarse from the performance but filled with newfound strength, "there's something I need to tell you, something I haven't talked about in over 50 years. The crowd, sensing that another revelation was about to unfold, quieted to an almost supernatural silence. George gestured for Bill to take his time, instinctively understanding that whatever was about to be shared would be significant. "Before Vietnam, before everything went to hell in my life, I was supposed to be where you are now," Bill said, his words carrying across the stadium with startling clarity. "In 1962, I had a recording contract with RCA Records in Nashville. I was 27 years old, and they said I was going to be the next big thing in country music." George felt his breath catch in his throat. RCA Records had been his own label early in his career, and he knew the significance of what Bill was claiming. The crowd, many of whom were country music aficionados, began to murmur with excitement and disbelief. "I had recorded 4 songs," Bill continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "The producer was Chet Atkins himself. He told me I had the most naturally gifted voice he'd heard since Hank Williams." The album was scheduled to be released in March of 1963. Sarah, still standing near the front of the stage, felt her legs give out slightly. She leaned against the security barrier, her mind reeling from these revelations about her grandfather's hidden past. Nothing in her family's history had prepared her for this moment. George, meanwhile, was doing rapid calculations in his head. Chet Atkins had been a legendary producer, responsible for launching the careers of countless country stars. If Bill was telling the truth, and his voice tonight suggested he absolutely was, then they were all witnessing something far more profound than a talented amateur getting his moment in the spotlight. "What happened?" George asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "December 15th, 1962, Bill replied, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had relived this moment countless times. "I got my draft notice 3 weeks before my 28th birthday, 6 weeks before my album was supposed to drop, and 2 days after I proposed to Margaret." The stadium was so quiet that the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 30 could be heard. 60,000 people were hanging on every word of a story that was unfolding like a country music ballad come to life. "I tried to get a deferment," Bill continued, his eyes distant as he traveled back through the decades. "Chet Atkins himself wrote a letter to the draft board, explaining that I had a recording contract and a career that was about to launch. But 1962 was when things were heating up in Southeast Asia, and they weren't too interested in entertainment deferrals." George found himself thinking about his own path to stardom. How different circumstances and timing had allowed his career to flourish. The randomness of fate, the thin line between success and obscurity, had never seemed more apparent. "So you went to Vietnam," George said, more statement than question. "And I served 13 months in Da Nang," Bill replied, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he spoke of his service. "I was a radio operator with the 1st Marine Division. We saw heavy action during the Tet Offensive in '68. The crowd's respect for Bill deepened even further. Many in the audience had family members who had served in Vietnam, and they understood the significance of his service during one of the war's most brutal periods. But here's the thing that nobody talks about when they discuss the cost of war. Bill continued, his voice taking on an educational tone that suggested he had thought deeply about these issues for decades. It is not just the physical wounds or the obvious trauma. Sometimes war takes pieces of your soul that you don't even realize are gone until years later. George nodded, having heard similar stories from other veteran friends over the years. But he sensed that Bill's story had layers yet to be revealed. When I came home in December of '68, RCA had given up on me, Bill said, a note of old pain creeping into his voice. The contract had been cancelled, the songs I recorded were shelved, and the music industry had moved on. Chet Atkins was kind enough to meet with me when I got back, but he said the sound had changed, the market was different, and there wasn't a place for what I was offering anymore. Boom! The injustice of it all hung heavy in the Texas air. Here was a man who might have been a contemporary of Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, and George Jones, whose career had been derailed not by lack of talent or poor choices, but by the simple misfortune of timing and circumstance. But that wasn't the worst part, Bill continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent stadium. The worst part was that I couldn't sing anymore. Not the way I used to. The music was still in my head, but when I opened my mouth, all that came out was the sound of helicopters, gunfire, and the voices of friends who didn't make it home. The crowd absorbed this revelation with visible emotion. Many people were crying openly now, understanding that they were witnessing not just a performance, but a form of healing that had been decades in the making. For 25 years, I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, Bill said with a sad smile. Margaret married me anyway, bless her heart. She said she fell in love with the man, not the voice. But I know she mourned for the music just as much as I did. George felt a profound respect for this man who had sacrificed so much for his country and received so little recognition in return. The parallels between their lives, the roads taken and not taken, created a connection that transcended their generational and experiential differences. What changed? George asked, genuinely curious about how Bill had been able to reclaim his voice tonight. You did, Bill replied simply, causing George to take a surprised step backward. Your music, George. Starting in the '80s, when I heard your songs on the radio, something started to heal inside me. It was like you were carrying on a conversation that I had started 30 years earlier. The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd. Many fans had always felt that George's music spoke to them personally, but here was someone claiming a direct spiritual connection between his own lost career and George's successful one. Your voice reminded me of what mine used to sound like, Bill continued. The phrasing, the tone, the way you understood what country music was supposed to be about. Every time I heard Amarillo Morning or All My Exes Live in Texas, I felt a little piece of my musical soul coming back to life. George was visibly moved by these words. He had always taken pride in his connection to traditional country music, but he had never imagined that his work might serve as a form of therapy for someone who had lost their own musical identity. And tonight, standing up here with you, singing our song together, it's like I am finally able to finish a conversation that was interrupted 56 years ago, Bill said, his voice growing strong again. Margaret always said the music would come back when it was meant to. She was right, as usual. The crowd erupted in another wave of applause, but this time it felt different. This wasn't applause for entertainment. This was recognition of something profound about human resilience, about dreams deferred but not destroyed, about the healing power of music to bridge gaps that seemed unbridgeable. George stood there, absorbing the full weight of Bill's story, when suddenly another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Something about the man's phrasing, his natural understanding of country music's emotional language, felt familiar in a way that went beyond simple admiration. Bill, George said slowly, a new realization dawning in his eyes. What was the name you recorded under at RCA? Bill I.'s expression changed subtly, a mixture of pride and vulnerability crossing his weathered features. He glanced out at the massive crowd, then back at George, as if weighing whether to reveal this final piece of his story. "Billy Ray Thompson," he said quietly, but the stadium's acoustics carried his words to every corner of the venue. They thought it sounded more commercial than William. George felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Billy Ray Thompson. The name hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it memories that he had buried in the deepest recesses of his mind. His face went pale as recognition dawned, and he took an unsteady step backward. "Sweet mother of pearl," George whispered, his voice picked up by his wireless microphone and broadcast to the stunned crowd. "You, Billy Ray Thompson." The way George said the name, with reverence and disbelief, sent ripples of excitement through the audience. They could sense that another revelation was coming, something that would make this already extraordinary evening even more remarkable. "You know that name?" Bill asked, genuinely surprised. George's hands were trembling now as 40-year-old memories came flooding back. He walked to the edge of the stage, picked up his water bottle with shaking hands, and took a long drink before returning to Bill's side. "Bill," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I was 21 years old and trying to make it in Nashville, broke as a church mouse and sleeping on studio couches, I found a box of demo recordings in the basement of RCA's old studio on Music Row. The janitor was about to throw them away, and I asked if I could have them to practice with." The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that this story was about to connect two lives in ways that seemed impossible. There were 4 songs in that box," George continued, his voice gaining strength as the memory became clearer. 4 of the most perfect country songs I had ever heard. The voice on those recordings became my template for everything I wanted to achieve as a singer. I must have listened to those demos 1,000 times. Bill's eyes widened as the implications of George's words began to sink in. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The name on the box was Billy Ray Thompson," George said, his voice now carrying across the stadium with crystal clarity. "One of the songs was called Texas Highway. Another was Dancing with My Darling. The third was Cowboy's Last Ride. And the fourth?" George paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm him completely. "The fourth was called All My Yesterdays," he finished, tears now streaming down his face. Bill felt his knees buckle, and George quickly stepped forward to steady him. The two men stood there, supporting each other physically and emotionally, as the full magnitude of their connection became clear. "I studied your voice, your phrasing, your delivery," George continued, his words coming in a rush now. "Everything that people say is distinctive about my sound, I learned from listening to Billy Ray Thompson sing. You didn't just influence my career, Bill. You created it." The stadium erupted in chaos. 60,000 people were on their feet, screaming, crying, and applauding as they witnessed something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of destiny. Social media exploded with posts about the incredible revelation unfolding at the George Strait concert. Sarah, still pressed against the security barrier, felt faint as the full circle of her grandfather's story became apparent. The man who had inspired America's most beloved country singer had been sitting quietly in her family's living room for her entire life, never mentioning his connection to the music that had shaped an entire generation. "But how is this possible?" Bill asked, his scientific mind struggling to process the coincidence. "It is not coincidence," George replied with absolute certainty. "This is bigger than chance, Bill. You were meant to be here tonight. We were meant to finish this story together." George turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 4 decades commanding stages. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight isn't just a fan getting to sing with his hero," he announced, his words reverberating through the stadium. You've watched the reunion of a teacher and his student, separated by 56 years and brought back together by the power of music itself. The crowd's response was deafening. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a moment of musical history unfolding in real time. People were calling friends and family members, trying to share what they were witnessing, but finding that words were inadequate to capture the magnitude of the experience. George looked at Bill with an expression of profound respect and gratitude. "I owe you everything," he said simply. "Every award, every #1 hit, every moment of success I've had in this business started with those 4 demo recordings in a basement in Nashville. And I thought my music died in Vietnam," Bill replied, his voice filled with wonder. "Turns out it just took a different path home." The two men embraced then, a long, heartfelt hug between mentor and student, between the dreamer who never got his chance and the man who carried that dream to heights beyond imagination. The crowd watched in reverent silence, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. When they finally separated, George had one more surprise. He gestured to his band, and they immediately began playing the opening chords of Amarillo Morning, one of George's most beloved songs. But instead of singing it himself, he handed the microphone back to Bill. "This is your moment," George said. "Sing it the way it was meant to be sung." Bill looked out at the sea of faces, 60,000 people who had given him the gift of their attention and their hearts. For the first time in over half a century, he felt like the performer he had always been meant to be. His voice, stronger now than it had been all evening, filled the stadium with a rendition of Amarillo Morning that was both familiar and completely new. George joined him for the chorus, and together they created a version of the song that was simultaneously a celebration and a lament, a recognition of dreams achieved and time lost. The crowd sang along, their voices joining with the two men on stage to create a moment of musical communion that none of them would ever forget. As the final notes faded away, George took the microphone one last time. "Bill Thompson," he announced to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who taught me how to sing country music." The applause that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of Arlington, Texas. Bill, exhausted but more alive than he had felt in decades, waved to the crowd with tears streaming down his face. George stood beside him, one arm around the elderly veteran's shoulders, both men understanding that they had just experienced something that transcended the boundaries between performer and audience, between past and present, between what was and what might have been. Later, as Bill was helped off the stage and reunited with Sarah, George approached them one final time. He handed Bill a business card with his personal phone number written on the back. "Call me tomorrow," George said. "We have a lot more talking to do, and I have some people in Nashville who need to hear those original recordings again." Bill looked at the card, then at George, then at his granddaughter, who was still processing everything she had learned about her grandfather's hidden past. "George," he said, his voice quiet but filled with contentment. "Margaret always said that everything happens for a reason. Tonight, I finally understand what she meant." As Bill and Sarah made their way out of the stadium, supported by the respectful applause of 60,000 new admirers, George Strait stood alone on the stage for a moment, contemplating the mysterious ways that music weaves through human lives. He had come to Arlington expecting to deliver another professional performance in his farewell tour. Instead, he had discovered the source of his own artistic identity and helped heal a wound that had been festering for over half a century. The evening had proven that some dreams never truly die. They just wait patiently for the right moment to resurrect themselves, often in ways more beautiful than originally imagined. Bill Thompson had gotten his last wish, but more importantly, he had reclaimed a piece of his soul that he thought was lost forever. And George Strait, the king of country music, had finally met the man who had taught him how to wear the crown.